Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a fascinating and honestly pretty mind-bending theory about the hidden architecture of our entire economy. Okay, so let's just start with this question. What if almost half the price you pay for, well, everything, isn't for the thing itself, but for hidden interest fees? It's a wild idea, right? The theory is that this hidden web of interest is baked into the price of every single product we buy. So let's unpack how that could even be possible.
Okay, so to get our heads around this, we're going to start small. We'll look at a simple model that shows how this hidden cost can build up step by step.
So just think about the journey any product takes to get to you. It starts with raw materials, then it gets processed, manufactured, distributed, and finally ends up in a retail store. Now, at every single one of these steps, businesses usually have to borrow money to operate, for things like inventory, equipment, payroll. And here's the key. They pass the cost of that interest on in the price they charge to the next business in the chain.
And what this does is create this really powerful compounding effect. It's kind of like a snowball of costs rolling downhill through the entire supply chain. Each step doesn't just add its own interest cost. It adds a markup on top of all the interest costs that came before it.
So what does this simple model actually add up to? Well, for something like your weekly groceries, it suggests that almost 10% of what you pay is just for these stacked up interest fees. And for something more complex like electronics, that number shoots up to over 18%. But here's the kicker. According to this theory, this is just scratching the surface. It gets way bigger.
Right, so why is that simple model just the beginning? Well, the argument is that it's way too conservative, because it leaves out some absolutely massive pieces of the puzzle. The reality, this theory claims, is on a whole different scale.
To get the real picture, you have to add in 4 huge interconnected layers of debt. First, you've got the long-term debt for things like building the factories and offices in the first place. Second, you have what are called recursive loops. That's just industries constantly selling parts and services to each other. Third, and this is a big one, you have to account for the cost of labor, which includes the personal debt, mortgages, car loans, student debt that workers are carrying. And finally, you have to add in the government debt layer. That's the chunk of our taxes that's used just to pay interest on government bonds.
So what happens when you factor all of that in? Well, the number just explodes. It jumps into a totally different league. The theory claims that somewhere between 35 and 45 cents of every single dollar you spend has nothing to do with the product or service itself. It's just going to service this gigantic, hidden web of interest.
And where does that staggering figure come from? Well, if you look at the breakdown, the theory says it's this combination of all those layers we just talked about. Embedded business debt, the direct consumer debt that workers have to cover with their wages, and yes, even that slice of our taxes that's just paying interest on government debt.
Okay, I know what you might be thinking. A claim this huge, that nearly half of our money is just interest, sounds, well, a little out there. And you're right to be skeptical. Mainstream economics has a whole set of very powerful counterarguments for why this is basically a fallacy.
The core rebuttal, really, is that this whole theory makes one gigantic error. It only counts the costs of debt and completely ignores all the incredible benefits. You see, from a mainstream perspective, interest isn't some hidden tax, it's the price we pay for progress. Debt is what lets us build factories, fund innovation, and actually make things cheaper in the long run. So this web isn't a trap at all. It's the scaffolding that built the entire modern world.
So, which is it? Is this hidden interest idea just a big misunderstanding? Well, the folks who came up with this theory say not so fast. They argue that the standard rebuttal misses a fatal flaw, and it's hidden in the one place most of us never, ever think to look: the actual mechanics of how money is created.
Most of us have this picture in our heads of how banking works, right? Savers deposit money, and the bank then lends that same money out to borrowers. It seems logical, but that's actually not how it works at all. In our modern system, when a bank makes a loan, it doesn't lend out existing money. It literally creates new money from scratch, just by typing numbers into your account. And this is where the theory points to the core problem. Look at this. The bank creates the $100 of principal when it issues the loan. But, and this is the whole point, it never creates the extra $5 that's needed to pay the interest. So right from the start, you have a mathematical problem. Across the entire economy, there is always more debt owed than there is money in existence to pay it all back.
So where does that extra money to pay the interest come from? Well, the only place it can come from is from more debt. Someone else has to take out a new loan to inject more money into the system. This means the system, by its very design, requires the total amount of debt to always be expanding.
just to be able to make the interest payments on all the old debt. It's a treadmill.
Now, if this is all true, then this mathematical requirement for constantly expanding debt isn't just some weird economic quirk. The theory argues it's like the fundamental source code for our entire society, creating these massive cascading consequences that ripple out and touch literally every part of our lives.
So let's look at those consequences. For you and me, on a personal level, it puts us all on a kind of hamster wheel. There's this constant pressure, not just to get ahead, but just to keep up with the cost of living that's always inflating to service all this debt. And that, the theory says, is a direct cause of so much financial panic and burnout.
Then, if we zoom out to the societal level, the system essentially acts like a giant vacuum cleaner. It constantly pulls wealth up from the working and middle classes to the very top, to those who own the income-producing assets and collect the interest payments. And that, according to the theory, breeds the extreme inequality, anger, and polarization we see all around us.
And what about the environmental impact? Well, think about it. The mathematical need for infinite economic growth to service an ever-expanding pile of debt runs headfirst into a very simple reality. We live on a finite planet. It demands we consume more and more and more forever to feed a machine that can never, ever be satisfied.
And then there's maybe the most powerful consequence of all, what the source material calls the eighth dimension. The system's greatest defense is simply that most of us have no idea how it works. It's protected by its own complexity, and that allows the whole machine to just keep running completely unchallenged.
So, when you put it all together, what does it create? A giant game of musical chairs. That's the best analogy, because there's always less money in existence than the total debt that's owed. There literally aren't enough chairs for everyone. Scarcity and competition aren't just byproducts. They are mathematically hardwired into the system.
And this leads to what might be the theory's most profound claim of all. It suggests that what we often call human greed isn't some deep, inherent flaw in our nature. For most of us, it's just a predictable, even logical survival strategy. I mean, if you put anyone in a game of musical chairs, they're going to fight for a seat. The behavior is a product of the game's rules.
Which of course leaves us with one final and very provocative question. If the fundamental design of our money system really is the root cause of so many of these huge, cascading problems, what would a system actually designed for human and planetary well-being even look like?